In this video we are going to see how to draw a dog starting with some basic shapes and gradually making it very realistic. And the model is available with the link in the description so you can draw along with me. So grab your pencils and let's get started. Let's start dividing our animal into shapes. So at the head level, I clearly see a circle as it is often the case. Right next to it, to encompass the snout and the mouth, there's another rectangle that we could extend inside our circle. Below that, there will be a trapezoid. Again, I could close it by working within the circle. As for the body, we could imagine this complex geometric shape. Each time we can close the shape, but it's not necessarily required. And finally, for the legs, I clearly see a succession of different rectangles of varying size, which will help complete the legs. Then I could eventually close it with lines. Now, how do we ensure the correct proportions for this dog? Once again, using these shape techniques, we can identify different proportions. For example, I clearly see a height breakdown of the head. I could draw 3 circles approximately the size of the head to represent the whole body. This way, I know that when I draw my dog, if the body is equal to 3 head heights, the proportions will be more or less correct for my dog. So this is a good reference point for getting the right proportions for our animal. Now it's time to draw these different shapes. I'm working on an A4 sheet about 20 by 30 centimeters. What's really interesting here is also saying how to work on a different scale. On the previous sheet where I sketched the shapes before drawing right now, the dog was much smaller than it will be now, so I think it's also very interesting. To start, I draw these 4 different circles, 1 for the head and 3 for the body. This way, before refining my shapes and drawing them, I already have an approximate proportion for the dog. I know its overall size will be based on these 4 head-sized circles. From there, I can draw the rectangle we identified earlier for the snout and the mouth. Then I extend a straight line beneath the head circle, continuing it down to the leg. This same straight line will help me outline the first small rectangles for the lower part of the leg. I then add more rectangles for the overlay section once I will have finished this. Okay, next, if I observe carefully, I see that this rectangle extends up to about the second circle. And I continue drawing the lower section lines right there, then another rectangle for the second leg. Again, I use the circles as a guide, noting that this second leg also extends to the second circle. Then I move on to the rest of the body, and I see a line that connects 2 of the circle, and this helps me position another shape correctly. Ultimately, these circles not only provide a general proportion reference, but also help us accurately position different elements relative to one another. And I finish by closing the structure with various lines, refining the complex body shape. And overall, with this basic shape, I now have a solid foundation to continue and refine the animal's outline in more detail. And by the way, you can see in the photograph that I have added these small red squares which clearly highlight these reference points I talked about. They help us properly place the different lines in our drawing. Let's start our blocking technique, and I'll begin with the head, specifically with the snout. So I started with the snout, but then I found the angles at the top of the head interesting to work on. I continued in this direction also because I didn't want to move down the snout toward the mouth just yet. It was a slightly complex area and I preferred to have other reference point to work with first. It seemed easier than starting from that side, and I preferred to connect it later from the other part of the dog's mouth by linking it from the neck. At this point, I was able to draw the color. When I carefully examined the shapes, I noticed that the color was positioned roughly between our two circles. Then, at the very top of the first circle, you can see that the dog's mouth begins again, so I can sketch it in. There are also some well-defined angles here that we can refine, particularly around the opening of the dog's mouth. You probably don't see this as I made quite a few cuts, but before drawing my angles, I always take time to carefully observe and analyze what I see. It's important for me to ensure that my drawing is done with the correct proportion. I cut out the moments where I was simply thinking, because watching me do nothing on the paper wouldn't be very engaging. That's why I removed those parts. However, know that I really take my time to ask myself in which direction is this angle going. You could even use an angle sighting to ensure accurate proportions. So take your time before working on it. That's exactly what I did, especially with the mouth opening, which is quite tricky. There are multiple lines and directions involved, so try to measure the different angles of this outline as accurately as possible. That's really the goal with this blocking technique. Another thing, I rely a lot on different elements for reference. Here I can see that the opening of the dog's mouth ends at roughly the same height where its neck begins. Once again, using different reference points makes it much easier to progress and ensures accuracy in the work we are doing. And you can see that I have added this line I talked about in blue on the photograph right here. Okay, now we can keep going with the other elements of the face of this dog. So now I can move on to the eye area now that I am done with this previous part. Once again, I will use reference points to help me draw and position the eye correctly. Placement is extremely important and you need to be very precise with this. What we can see here is that once again we can use imaginary lines to help us. I noticed that the right corner of the eye, using an imaginary line, aligns roughly with the corner of the mouth. You can see this with the green line that will appear on the side. It connects the corner of the eye to the mouth. Then the left corner of the eye is approximately at the midpoint of the upper part of the head. Here I can also visualize an imaginary line connecting them. This is another green line that you see. Finally, the lower part, we can imagine a line starting from the snout and running across the entire head, with the eye position along this line. Of course, it won't be 100% accurate using just these imaginary lines, but they will greatly help by providing reference points to place the dog's eye as accurately as possible. From there, it's all about comparison, observing, analyzing the drawing and checking it against the reference photograph to determine if the positioning is correct. Next, this eye will be extremely dark. The real difference will come once we start shading. It's at this stage that we will see whether the result is satisfactory or if adjustments are needed. At this point, what I do is mark the different small gray areas within the eye as well as the darker areas surrounding it. Once this is done, everything should be in place with this eye and we can move on to the next step of the drawing. Normally, I tend to draw the entire outline of the animal before working on the interior details, the contour of this element, but in this case, I just couldn't resist it. I really wanted to position the eye and get a sense of how my drawing would look, even just with the outline and that eye to see if it would be accurate or not. So yes, I broke my usual rule, but as they say, rules are made to be broken. It's not a big deal. You can absolutely start with one element and then move on to something else. It doesn't disrupt the overall drawing process. Now I can continue, and from here I will mark the different angles that will define the rest of the body. This step won't be too different from our previous work on the shapes, as those were already quite precise and didn't require many adjustments. Perhaps here I had forgotten to add the hind leg, which was hidden by the grass, so I will include that as well. But overall, the angles won't be too pronounced. Of course, there will be some, but not as many as in other drawings where angles are more prominent. So now I have reached the leg area and I will progress steadily, focusing on this blocking technique, refining the angles across the entire body. Here I can mark the transition between the white fur and the lighter fur on the dog's chest. This is another key aspect of blocking, marking only the contours that will be useful later inside the contour itself. For example, I know that drawing the dog's leash on his chest will help as a reference, so I will mark it, and the same goes for any other distinct elements. Whether they are darker or lighter areas that need to be defined, I define what will help me in the future to make a better shading. For the legs, I don't need to be very overly precise at this stage. A basic outline will be enough for now. Later, I might refine the details and work on shading, but this should be sufficient. The same applies to the silhouette, the global contour. I will refine it more precisely later. I likely won't need to draw every single tuft of fur sticking out, as each small detail will take shape naturally as I progress and as I will shade my drawing. The last element I need to complete is this large ear. To determine its exact placement, I once again rely on comparisons with other elements. For example, I compare the height of the ear with the height of the dog's jaw. Once that alignment looks correct, I erase any unnecessarily guidelines and will refine the contour with a bit more fluidity. At this stage, I will adjust some of the edges to be slightly more rounded than before. This helps create a softer and more natural outline that better represents the final outlook of the drawing. The goal is to achieve a light and dynamic contour that captures the essence of this beautiful dog. Now that my outline is well defined, I'm going to start working on the interior of the dog, refining the different elements within the contour. We had already marked key features like the eye, the snout, the inner ear, the leash, and the patch on the lower part. Now I will focus on marking these elements more precisely. I will start by sketching the dog's teeth, which are quite prominent and noticeable. It's important not to forget them as they add character to the drawing. Then I will define all the shadowed areas, the shading that will appear throughout the dog's body. I will also carefully mark the borders of these shadowed regions, distinguishing between the darker spots and the lighter shaded areas. For example, in the ear, you can see that there are numerous shadowed areas. Even though it might seem a bit complex at first, we can break it down into smaller sections. On one side, there's a fairly light area, while in the middle, a dark line separates different shapes. By identifying these variations now, shading later will be much easier. I won't have to constantly figure out where the dark and light areas go. I'll have already mapped them out and it will be easier. This preparation makes the shading process smoother and more efficient in my mind. Now, moving to the legs, I extended my line slightly and will define the shadow areas behind it. The shading clearly reveals our light source, which is coming from above and slightly to the right. As a result, most of the elements on the left side will be darker. With this step almost complete, we'll almost be ready to move on to the actual shading phase of the drawing. Now let's begin shading our piece. I will start with the eye. It's an old habit of mine. When I was younger and just starting out with drawing and portraits for animal or human beings, I used to believe that if I got the eye right, everything else would naturally follow and turn out well. Of course, that's not always true, but I've still kept this habit over time. So let's get started. And in the upper part of the eye, it is incredibly dark. So I am using a 14B pencil, pressing down firmly on my lines. And I will begin by marking all the darkest elements in the eye as they are the most obvious and noticeable. Once those are in place, it becomes much easier to add the rest of the details. Among the darkest areas, there's the upper outline of the eye, the lower outline, and the corner of the eye, which is also quite dark. While shading the eye itself, I also focus on the surrounding elements as they contribute to making the eye appear more realistic. One key detail to mention is that my pencils are very well sharpened, which helps me get precise details. In the corner of the eye, you can see that there's a subtle shift in tone, just a slight difference in gray. You might barely notice it, but I apply a bit less pressure on my pencil in this area to create this effect. Now moving back to the inner part of the eye, the outer edge is very dark as you can see, and as I approach the highlight area where the light hits the eye, the shading gradually lightens. To achieve this effect, I apply lighter strokes as I move toward the upper part, allowing the gray tones to transition smoothly from dark to light. I continue working on the eye, and now I am switching pencils. I will use something lighter, an 8B pencil, to refine the variations in gray tones. There is a noticeable shift in tone on the left corner of the eye, and using an 8B helps create a smoother transition without an abrupt jump from shadow to highlight. This allows for a more natural gradient. Another key feature here is the well-defined line running beneath the eye. I've drawn it with the 8B, pressing down firmly to make it stand out while keeping it subtle enough for a seamless blend. Now, with my 8B pencil, I will continue refining the shading around the eye. Looking at the surrounding elements, we can see carefully planned shadows that contribute to the realism of the eye. I will also mark these areas with the 8B, especially the angles I previously outlined and the deeper recesses around the eye. Under the eye, so there's also a slightly lighter area that I want to emphasize. I want it to create a strong contrast against the darker shadow of the eye that I drew before. And step by step, this eye is becoming more and more alive and more realistic. Now I'm going to shade the entire head of the dog. To begin, I'll apply an HB on the upper part of the head, since this area contains the lightest elements of the face. HB seems like a good choice to establish a base layer without making it too dark. One important step here is also erasing the initial contour line I drew earlier. The reason why I am doing this is that my outline is actually darker than the shading I am currently applying. This happens quite often, and if I don't erase it, the drawing might look off as if something isn't quite right. Once I have laid down the HB shading, I switch to something slightly darker. Since the gradual transition from light to dark becomes noticeable as we move toward the lower part of the head, I use a 2B pencil to start intensifying the shadows. This helps define the deeper areas more effectively. Seeing that the 2B isn't quite enough for the darker parts below, I'm going to move on to 6B for the lower region. At this stage, I am not focusing on texture or fur details, that will come later. Right now, my goal is simply to accurately map out the shadowed areas across the dog's head. By marking these shadows carefully, the head will start to appear more three-dimensional and voluminous. Now I move to something even darker with the 10B pencil. With this, I emphasize the deepest shadows in the lower part of the head, as these areas are extremely dark. With the 10B, I get something that is a bit darker than 6B before jumping to the 14B. And with the 14B, I can now shade the area under the jaw and on the lowest part of this face. This will reinforce the darkest elements in this area. These rich, deep tones help add some weight and structure to the drawing, making the shading feel natural and well balanced. And right now, already my drawing is starting to look kind of three-dimensional, so this is great. We are on the right path. Now that I have created a shading base that is quite satisfying, I can start working more on the details and also begin working on the texture of this dog, specifically its fur. What I'm going to do is start with my 14B pencil to define the different elements we have. For example, under the eye area, I can see that there are some darker elements and I notice this line. On the lower part, I also see elements that are very dark in 14B and I can go ahead and mark them as well. I'm starting with the darkest elements because I would say these are the most obvious details in this area. It's true that in my drawings you often see me gradually transitioning from light to dark, marking the 14B elements at the end. And that's the case, for instance, when we work on the horse and specifically on its leg. So that's something that I usually do, but it's also completely possible to start by adding dark elements first, dark details first, as I am doing here. So both approaches are valid. It depends on the situation and depending on what we are working on. Sometimes it's better to use one method over the other. It's up to us to get a feel for it and decide which approach works best in each case. Next, I mark all the elements that I see as very dark in 14B. The reason I do this is that I want to be efficient in my drawing and it speeds up the process when I mark all the elements of the same value across the entire drawing. Also, when I look at my reference, and it's easier to focus on one value at a time. Now, don't get me wrong, I love drawing, I love creating, but I also like when things move quickly because I enjoy being efficient. It's part of my personality, but I like efficiency, especially when drawing animals in real life. When observing them, you need to be quick because unfortunately animals don't hold still, or if they do, it's never for long. That's why I always keep efficiency in mind and mark all the elements of the same value at once. Now that I have done that, I will start working on the fur. I will start working on the medium value fur. And so I am adding short hairs. Again, I haven't emphasized it enough, but for this dog's head, we are dealing with short fur. And I will mark them with an intermediate gray value, which will be lighter than what I just applied with the 14B. Another important thing to keep in mind when working on texture is to leave certain areas light, like under the eye for example, or on some other parts of the head, and not over texture the fur or get too caught up in the details. When we try to add too many individual hairs, that's when we realize that the drawing no longer works and doesn't look natural. Just adding a few small strokes, as I am doing now, to suggest the texture is enough. There's no need to overload the drawing. At least that's my opinion. If you want to experiment, well, go for it. But in my view, overloading a drawing with too much fur detail runs the risk of making it look less successful. Another thing that I can do with the fur is to add a very few dark touches on the edges where certain elements stand out, like where the whiskers typically are. Or maybe that's only for cats. Honestly, I'm not sure anymore about the whiskers of a dog or not. But there are some slightly darker elements that needed to be marked, and so that's what I did, right there near the snout. And so about the snout, I can move on to the snout now. I'll start by marking the darkest areas because they will serve as reference points before shading the rest. Even on the snout, I'll try to draw as faithfully as possible to what I see. However, this isn't a huge format I sometimes use for painting, where I work on canvases over a meter wide. Here I'm working on an A4 sheet of paper, so there's less need to get overly caught up in details. Adding a few small details is great, but what really matters is accuracy in values. For example, when working on the snout, I won't make everything too dark. I will leave some lighter areas to stand out. This is what will make the snout look realistic and help the entire dog appear lifelike. This work on values, balancing shading, light areas and darker areas is truly the key to making an animal come to life on paper. Now let's move on to the dog's mouth. As I did before, I start by marking all the darkest elements visible in this area using my 14B pencil. I mark them because they are the most noticeable features in this zone, and doing this first makes it much easier to place the lighter elements afterward. So I carefully place these dark areas with my 14B, making sure to be as precise as possible to keep things simple. There is a dark section towards the back on the left, as well as some dark elements near the dog's fang. I also notice a few darker spots in the lower area, but overall that's about it for the darkest elements of this area. So just right here, a few more dark elements, and that will be it. So next, I'm going to work on the mid-tone areas between this dark section, and this mid-tone will also be pretty dark, so I will still use my 14B pencil but apply less pressure on my pencil. This way the shading remains dark but with subtle variations in value, making the transition more natural. Then, with my eraser pen, I create even lighter details to add more volume to this area, making it feel more realistic. For this small area I am about to shade, I notice that the shading is darker on the left than on the right, so I will press a bit harder on the left while keeping the right side lighter to maintain the contrast and creating more realism in this area. For the tongue, I will use my pencil, the same pencil, but with an extremely light touch so that it stands out well. Then, with the eraser, I will leave some graphite to highlight the natural shine of the tongue that we can see on the right. For the teeth now, I find that outlining them first, especially the fangs, makes it much easier to shade them and the tongue above them. Since the tongue is folded, it requires special shading to reflect its natural shape and depth. And as for the fangs, I won't leave them pure white. Instead, I will gently apply an HB pencil over them because, contrary to what we might assume, teeth are never completely white. They tend to be more of a grayish tone. Finally, the last detail I am going to add once this is done will be a subtle highlight below the teeth before drawing this dark line along the lower part of the mouth. This line is dark but is slightly less intense than the shading inside the dog's mouth. And that will be it. And now we will be ready to move on to the other parts of the body once I will have applied this line just right there I talked about before. Alright, now I am satisfied with the face of the dog and I can move on to the next area. So in the logical order of things, I think we can continue with the ear. The ear is not necessarily going to be the easiest area to work on because there are hairs going in all directions. And on top of that, the zones can be somewhat complex to analyze and separate. So the first thing I do is mark the boundaries between all these different areas and identify the hairs or fur that seem the most characteristic, the ones that stand out the most and will help establish clear separations between the different elements of these dog's hair. Generally, these are the darker elements that can be identified within this already dark area. I have also marked some lighter hair on the right that helps separate this lighter fur group from the darker area on the left. Overall, what I have done so far should be enough for now. Now I'm going to apply a base layer for my shading, and in this part of the hair we can see some very bright highlights. So I apply my base shading with an 8B pencil, and on top of that I will add some darker elements where needed. However, for the adjacent area, since it is much darker, I use an 8B pencil for my base shading. This way I have a darker foundation to work from. This is how I progress, allowing me to start with confidence and peace of mind in this area without making things too complicated at this stage. By breaking it down step by step like this, we simplify the task of working on the ear of this dog. You can notice that I have added very dark elements in this upper part to create a separation from the head area as seen in the reference image. For this I use a 14B pencil, and from there I can add a few hairs that are lighter than the elements in 14B but slightly darker than the HB base layer I created underneath. And this is how I will proceed with the ear. Gradually, I will add elements that get darker and darker, incorporating hairs that go in multiple directions while giving them a slightly curved effect. This is what will give my dog that wavy fur texture. What is also noticeable is that on top of the skull some hairs appear to be flowing as if caught in the wind. I sketch them delicately with a very light pencil so they don't stand out too much, as this area is quite bright. As mentioned earlier, the hairs have a wavy motion in multiple directions, so I carefully mark them. I define strong dark elements like this, and little by little this will give the hair its realistic appearance, as seen in the reference photograph. Here I'm really working with the tip of my pencil because I want to refine the fur texture. I aim for precision in my work while also creating strong contrast where necessary. That's why working with the fine tip makes the most sense when adding details for the fur. To enhance the area and create more depth, once I will be done with these dark elements that I am currently adding, I will use my eraser pen to erase, to lift certain spots and make them more contrasted and with some highlights, just like it needs to be done to create some volume as well. And I treat the erasing process as if I were drawing with the pencil, carefully sculpting the highlights as if I were drawing some wavy hair. We are good and we've done what needed to be done with this area. Now I'm going to move on to the adjacent area, which is darker, and as you can see, I will start by adding darker elements, group of slightly darker strokes. These give me reference points before working on the different sections in more detail. For the rest, I will now add individual hairs. I'm not trying to place them exactly millimeter by millimeter as they appear in my reference photograph, because if I were drawing a live dog instead of working from a photograph, it will be nearly impossible to capture each hair with such precision. Instead, the key here is to observe the general directions of the fur, identifying where the darker and lighter areas are, and add them accordingly. Just like in the upper part, you can also see that I have added a few stray hair extending outward to enhance the impression of fur blowing in the wind. I continue working on these elements in the lower section, and step by step this hair will take shape through the darker details I had throughout. And as you have noticed, in certain spots I will create more depth by adding lighter elements. highlights that stand out, which I achieve using my eraser pen. And overall, I will continue finalize this work by continuing this process, repeating it across the remaining areas of the ear of this dog. If you are enjoying this video, know that there are many more waiting for you. On my website, you will find dozens of hours of real-time drawing lessons. We cover all the main topics, the fundamentals to get started, portraits, the human body, animals, and perspective to build entire scenes. Each tutorial is guided from start to finish, as if you were drawing right by my side. You will learn how to correct your mistakes, how to gain precision, and give more strength to your drawings. So if you want to improve and explore all these drawing courses, click on the link in the description. Otherwise, let's get back to this video. Since the ear is now complete, I can move on to the area below it. This section is important, not because it's a defining feature of the dog, like the muzzle or the eyes, but because it will help the ear stand out, creating more volume and enhancing the three-dimensional effect. I start by shading the most significant elements in this area. There are some very dark elements where the fur meets the ear and at the lower part near the leash. I shade these with a 14B pencil to ensure they stand out properly. Then, between these dark areas, there are slightly lighter elements. So to create smooth transition between these zones, I apply less pressure with my 14B pencil. I will do that once I will be finished with the very dark elements. And that will be pretty much all there is to do to it. On the side, you will also see at the very end I will use a lighter base with a 2B pencil, as this area has some slightly lighter effect on the left. This section won't take too much time since it doesn't contain many intricate elements. However, it's still essential to execute it properly to maintain consistency throughout the entire artwork. Some areas like this one don't require excessive time, but they play a crucial role in ensuring harmony within the overall composition. If certain parts of the drawing are extremely well executed with high detail and precision, while others are neglected, the final piece will feel unbalanced. Sometimes these less prominent areas might not seem as exciting to work on. They aren't the focal points of an object, an animal, or a person, but they need to be well executed to maintain realism. For example, if we compare this to a portrait of a person, it reminds me of drawing an ear. Whenever I do a portrait, I often feel like the ear is one of the least appealing things to draw. It's not necessarily the most striking feature that defines a person's likeness, but if the ear is poorly rendered, it can ruin the overall result. The person might become unrecognizable, or the first thing a viewer might notice is that something feels off. That's a shame because an otherwise well-drawn portrait can be diminished by one poorly executed element. And so I thought the comparison would be almost the same thing with this area that we work on. And so, as you can see, I have now started to work on the fur texture of this element, adding some small pencil strokes here and there, just like we did before, adding some darker elements on the 14B area and some lighter ones now with the pencil eraser, and this way this area will be realistic, and that will be pretty much of it for this zone. Now let's work on this area to the right where the fur appears white. Starting from the neck area, I had the dark element that can be seen here, as well as another one on the side. Then just below that there is another slightly darker section. For this part I apply much less pressure on the pencil to create a much lighter gray. Next, we have this section of white fur, but upon closer observation, it's not truly white, it's more of a very light gray. That's why I use an HB pencil rather than leaving the white of the paper, which will be too bright. Again, for this area, I follow the same approach. I establish a base layer to work on. On the side, the fur becomes slightly darker, so instead of using HB, I switch to a 2B pencil to define that element. Now I can start adding more details. First, I extend the fur that originates from the left of the ear area and flows into this section. I also work on the hairs coming from the head that overlap this part. And finally, on the side, some slightly dark hairs add depth. Here, I can create movement with my pencil strokes. Once again, I observe that the fur has a slightly wavy or curly texture. To capture this realistically, I use circular strokes here and there to create that movement. Over the HB base, I add slightly darker elements to make the texture stand out. This enhances the sense of motion and depth in the fur. Similarly, on the side, I can introduce even darker hairs to further emphasize this effect. And that's about all for this section, and once it's complete, I can move on to the leash area. So I will add just more finishing touches, some stray hair overlapping into different areas, and this part of the drawing will be done. Let's work on the leash. It should be fairly straightforward, nothing too complicated with this area. For the leash, I'm using a 12B pencil because it appears slightly lighter than some of the darker shading I applied, for example on the ear. Although I'm using 12B, I still apply firm pressure to make sure it stands out properly. To prevent visible pencil strokes, I use circular motions with the pencil tip. Additionally, I refine the strands of the fur that overlap the leash. This helps enhance the realism of the drawing by integrating the leash naturally into the scene. Overall, that's all about there is to say for this section. It's not particularly complex. In the reference photograph, the leash has small patterns, but since my drawing isn't very large, I think adding them would do more harm than good. It will be very challenging to capture them clearly at this scale. Avoiding them with extreme precision would require unnecessary effort for this particular lesson, so I'll skip them and leave the leash plain. Sometimes, depending on the drawing and the effect we want to achieve, we don't need to include every detail, especially if they don't contribute significantly to the overall impact. Here's what my dog looks like at this point now that the head is finished. Now let's move on to the lower part of the body, starting with the area on the left. Why this area? Well, simply because I had to start somewhere, and this left section felt like a good place. I could have just as easily begun on the right, but I decided to go with this one. As usual, I begin by marking the most obvious elements, those that stand out clearly. Here I notice that the outline of the paw, a very dark area, is quite prominent. So using my 14B pencil, I define it with strong pressure, making sure to also sketch the small hairs that overlap the paw on the right. Next, one obvious element is that bright area at the top. I lightly shade it with my HB pencil, and I notice that this light patch extends slightly to the side, so I include that as well. And from here, I see that most other elements are also quite distinct, so I will work progressively from top to bottom, shading the entire area before refining the texture to make the dog look more realistic. For the darker section, I have opted for a 6B pencil to define them. I also extend the black line I initially marked, keeping it slightly lighter than the 14B shading, but still dark enough to stand out more than the surrounding elements I have shaded. Next, I continue shading the different areas, applying the dominant gray tone for each section while maintaining precision. At this stage, I focus on building a soft, even base, ensuring that the shading is smooth and avoiding harsh pencil strokes on the paper. To achieve this effect, I also use the side of my pencil tip as I usually do when shading and laying down a foundation. Now I can move on to the pause. In the left corner, there is an extremely dark section which I will shade using a 12B pencil. Meanwhile, the more oval-shaped area on the right has a noticeable value difference, so I will use an 8B pencil to capture that variation. And that will be all for now. This will establish a solid base before adding further details. Now that I have applied a solid base, I can start working on the different layers of fur in this area and refine it in more detail. For example, in the lightest area at the top, you can notice some slightly darker elements. So I have worked on this part by adding a few darker touches. The same goes for the intermediate area that I initially shaded with 6B. Now I can enhance it with a 12B pencil to introduce slightly darker elements. This step is crucial because just like with the neck area, working on those details will allow me to create the movement of the dog's fur and achieve that slightly wavy effect. By focusing on this detail, I try to capture the thickness and density of the fur without overloading the drawing with unnecessary elements. And little by little, the fur will come to life through the different layers of shading that I carefully add. It's important to be patient and take the time needed to create a harmonious texture and realistic one. Taking the time also means being gentle with the pencil stroke that I had and observing a lot the different layers, the subtle changes in values that we can see as we progress. And the same goes with the small highlight made, the same applies to the small highlights made with the eraser pen. This one should be worked in smoothly and delicately so that the pencil marks are not too harsh and don't appear forced. Achieving a soft and natural effect is key to giving the fur its realistic wavy texture, and by taking the time to refine these details, I can create the illusion that some strand of fur slightly separate from the rest, enhancing the sense of movement. Here you can see that I have already applied a pretty solid base in certain areas, and now I can start adding more detail and darker elements that will stand out even more now what I have done so far. Right now I am using a very dark pencil in some areas, and I won't hesitate to go over certain parts multiple times, especially in the upper section. I can also add a few extra dark details if I feel they are necessary. For example, as I observe the drawing, I notice some strands of fur that I want to make stand out more, so I go back and apply some additional darker elements. And I will continue progressing this way until I am fully satisfied with the entire area. Finally, I will complete this area by working on the pause. I'm not sure of how you spell it, sorry. In the lower section, the left paw won't be too detailed, it primarily be very dark. So I'm adding more dark elements like this. Yes, that should be good. For this one, I noticed that my initial shading wasn't dark enough, the one on the right, so I'm going over it again to achieve the right value, and I will refine it a bit more afterward. Because I also noticed some stray hair on the side, the ones that appear to be blowing in the wind, and I think they don't stand out enough, so I need to add a few darker touches over them to enhance the contrast, and there we go. Now I can go back to refining the paw, and I see that the center has very dark areas which I will define more clearly. Next to them there are some slightly lighter hairs and others that are much brighter, which I can soften using my eraser pen. And overall that should be enough for these paws, and with this section fully completed I can now move on to the next area. Alright, let's move on to the next paw. On this one, I noticed that there are multiple values spread throughout different areas, so I need to establish a base that encompasses most of these variations. On the left side and at the bottom of the paw, I see that the overall tone is pretty light, so I don't overthink it. I simply apply a light base that will allow me to shade different elements more easily. Meanwhile, in between these areas, I noticed that the base is significantly darker. This section will be more shadow, so I switch to a darker pencil and lay down a strong and dark foundation, which I will later enhance with even darker details. This is an area where the fur flows in various directions. On the left side, the fur is quite wavy, while on the upper part, where the white area is, things become a bit more complex. So I'll need to be careful with how I work on this section when I will be adding the details of this area. For this white part, this white area, you can see that I am applying a very light HB base. It's barely visible. This way I can later add some darker elements on top, and that will be enough to create a fairly realistic foundation. In this area, there is a very dark edge that clearly separates the paw from the torso, and as you can see, I have marked it well, pretty darkly. This part requires patience, this area that we are working on. Once I start adding details, I will observe the natural movement of the fur. And looking at the lower part of the paw, I can see an interesting movement in the fur that will be nice to work on toward the end. Now it's time to add the individual hairs and details. I noticed that in the upper part, some dark hairs stand out clearly. Since I can easily identify them, I mark them right away. This gives me reference points, making it much easier to add another surrounding details later on. By marking the most prominent elements first, I can progressively refine the entire area with more precision. So this is really meticulous work, and I'll need to be very patient to carefully mark the entire fur texture in this area with precision and add the necessary details. It requires a lot of observation, but step by step the fur is taking shape and starting to gain volume. That means I'm on the right track, and I just need to keep going this way to create something that looks right. Finally, in this area, I will now add the darkest elements next to the moderately light hairs I worked on earlier. These dark elements will really help my work stand out and enhance the sense of volume even more. This is essentially the final touch for this section. These dark hairs create a strong contrast compared to what was there initially, making the entire area more defined and dynamic. Now I am reaching the lowest part of the paw, and in this area there is a clear separation between the slightly darker section above and the paw itself. At this stage it's crucial to pay attention to the movement created by the fur. The hair flows in different directions with a beautiful wavy effect. My goal is to capture this movement before moving on to the final part of the section, or rather the lowest part, where the darkest element will be. I can also enhance the contrast by emphasizing the lighter elements found on the right, making the overall texture more dynamic and well defined. Now that I have worked on the fur, I'm going to focus on the small details at the very bottom of the paw. This area is quite chaotic with elements going in all directions. To simplify the process, I start by marking the dark elements first. These are easy to identify, making them a good reference point. Once these are in place, it becomes much easier to add finer details, small hairs flowing in different directions, which will make the paw look completely natural. At first glance, it may seem like a mess, very disorderly, but it is actually a controlled chaos. The hairs aren't placed randomly. I intentionally create this disorganized effect to achieve a realistic look. From the dark elements I have marked, I then observe the surrounding hairs and carefully add them to enhance the sense of realism in this section. This kind of detailing can feel overwhelming at first, but it's easy to wonder where to start. But as with many things, beginning with the darkest and most obvious elements makes the process much easier. Once they are positioned, I can gradually add more details, and step by step the entire area will come together. Now I think that I have achieved a result that looks very close to reality and matches exactly what I wanted for this part of the drawing. So it's going to be good and finished, and we'll be able to move on to the next area of the drawing. This area I am about to work on might also seem chaotic at first glance, with elements going in all directions. So once again, I need to be methodical and try to make sense of it. First, in this first section that appears white, I have already added some darker elements to make it stand out better. Next, I carefully observe my drawing and mark the most obvious elements. One thing that stood out to me was that the edge on the left looked too sharp and I wanted the fur to create a smoother transition. Speaking of obvious elements, in this section I noticed that some hairs flow downward, forming an angle wave-like shape, so I add them in. To finalize this element, I will take my eraser pen and use it to highlight lighter areas that stand out, creating a sense of undulation in the fur, creating something wavy. Now that I have done that, I can move on to the slightly lower section, as well as the area above where I see all the curved strands of fur, and I add them in gradually, one element at a time, and this way what initially seemed confusing starts to become clearer. In here there is also a very dark section, which I shade using a 12B pencil. It looks good, but even though I'm using 12B, I'm careful not to press too hard because I plan to erase some parts later. However, where possible, I reserve certain areas to keep them naturally lighter. And because I haven't pressed too hard with my 12B pencil, I can still use the eraser pen in the very dark section to lighten specific hair, specific fur. And I can apply this technique to other areas as well. But when I have the opportunity to be precise and avoid shading over very light areas, I take advantage of it just as I did in this section. And so I left some areas blank and I will shade them later on with something a little bit lighter than what I am currently doing with the 12B pencil. So, like I said, I shade a little bit this very light area. Then for the dark area at the top, I refine it as well using my eraser to soften some parts. However, my eraser is leaving marks that are a bit too thick, and to fix this, I go over it again with a well-sharpened pencil to improve the definition and refine the lighter hairs in this section. Next, in the lower part, one element stands out as an obvious detail that needs to be added: the deep shadow between the dog's legs. It's indeed very dark, but later I will use the eraser to bring out some lighter hairs, adding more texture. Just beside this, I start shading some slightly darker some dark areas while being careful to leave out sections for lighter details that I will refine later. And bit by bit, I am nearing the completion of this section. What initially seemed chaotic and difficult to render is now taking shape, becoming more structured, and finally gaining volume. So now I add the final dark details, and to complete this part, I plan to do a thorough pass with the eraser pen. This will help bring out more volume, making sure that the lighter hairs stand out clearly against the dark areas. And with this final step, the section should look much more realistic with well-defined contrast and depth, and that will be it for this area, once I will have erased some strands of hair. Here is my dog, and I'm quickly shading this area. I will also speed up the detailing process, since overall it's the same technique as what we did on the other paw. The main difference is that the fur movements are slightly different, but the approach remains the same. I have shaded using different gray values because there are clearly distinct sections with well-defined contrast on this leg. Once again, the key to working on this area is carefully observing the movement of the fur and always starting with the most obvious element. For example, in the lighter upper section, I noticed some slightly darker hairs, so I added them. Moving downward to the lower part, I see that most of the fur flows toward the right, except for a few longer, darker strands that go to the left, so I marked those as well. And step by step I will continue adding these final elements to complete the POW. So stay motivated because we are almost at the finish line. I know that after a while, working on fur textures can become tiring. Don't hesitate to take a break if you need one. Personally, I work on this drawing in multiple sessions instead of doing it all at once. Life's daily commitments mean that we don't always have hours of uninterrupted time to draw, so take your time. Rushing through it could ruin all the great work you have done so far. Also, I like to go back to previous previously completed areas and refine them, adding some overlapping fur strands that extend from one section to another. For instance, the fur in this new section blends into the one we worked on earlier, so it's important to ensure a seamless transition. As for the lower part of the POW, I will use the same method as before, marking the visible dark areas first, and once that's done, the only thing left will be to add a small background element at the bottom to ground the dog so it doesn't look like it's floating in mid-air. And well, alright, and then I'll check back in once that's finished. It shouldn't take too long. To complete my work, I have drawn a few lines under the dog's paws to create the impression that it is firmly seated on the ground. So that concludes this video. I really hope you enjoyed it and that it was helpful. And if you'd like to take your skills even further, I truly encourage you to join us on the website mentioned in the description. You will get access to all the drawing and painting courses to help you make real progress in your artwork. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you very soon in the new video.